The morning of October 13th, 1907, dawned crisp and clear over the grand estate of Blackwood Manor, located in the rolling hills of Massachusetts. Eleanor Blackwood stood at the tall windows of the drawing room, watching as the photographer Mr. Cornelius Hartwell carefully arranged his bulky equipment on the front lawn. Today was to be a momentous occasion, the first formal family portrait in the Blackwood family's 50-year history. "Mother, must we really go through with this tedious affair?" complained 17-year-old Margaret Blackwood, adjusting the high collar of her burgundy velvet dress for the third time. Standing still for what feels like an eternity, while that contraption captures our souls, seems rather unsettling. Eleanor turned from the window, her expression a mixture of maternal patience and aristocratic determination. At 42, she was still a handsome woman, though the years of managing both the household and her husband's increasingly erratic behavior had etched fine lines around her green eyes. "Margaret, dear, this portrait is not merely for our own enjoyment," Eleanor explained, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her own navy blue dress. "Your father believes it will serve as an important record for future generations of Blackwoods. Besides, we can hardly refuse now that Mr. Hartwell has traveled all the way from Boston." 13-year-old Thomas burst into the room with the enthusiasm typical of boys his age, his dark hair still damp from his morning wash. "Father says the camera can capture ghosts if they're present during the exposure," he announced breathlessly. "Do you suppose there are any ghosts at Blackwood Manor?" "Thomas!" Eleanor's voice carried a sharp note of warning. "You know perfectly well that your father sometimes says things he doesn't mean, especially when he's been—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Especially when he's been indisposed." Margaret shot her younger brother a knowing look. Everyone in the household was aware of their father's increasing dependence on laudanum, though it was never spoken of directly. Jonathan Blackwood's indisposition had become more frequent and more pronounced over the past year, leading to wild conversations about spirits, ancient curses, and other supernatural nonsense that seemed to emerge from the bottles he kept hidden throughout the house. "Where is father, anyway?" Margaret asked, glancing toward the doorway. "Surely Mr. Hartwell will want to begin soon." As if summoned by her words, Jonathan Blackwood appeared in the doorway. At 45, he was still an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with prematurely silver hair that gave him a distinguished appearance. However, those who looked closely could see the telltale signs of his affliction: the slight tremor in his hands, the dilated pupils, and the way he seemed to be listening to sounds only he could hear. "The photographer is ready for us," he announced, his voice carrying an odd, hollow quality. "I've instructed him to position us near the old oak tree. The light there is appropriate for what we need to accomplish." Eleanor frowned. "What we need to accomplish?" "Jonathan, it's simply a family portrait." "Nothing is simple about this family, my dear Eleanor," Jonathan replied, his gaze seeming to focus on something beyond the room's walls. "Nothing has been simple since we inherited this place from my uncle. But today, we'll have proof." "Proof of what?" Thomas asked, his curiosity overcoming his caution. Jonathan's eyes snapped to his son with an intensity that made the boy step back. "Proof that we are not alone in this house. Proof that the stories the servants whisper are more than mere superstition." Before Eleanor could respond, a knock at the front door interrupted the conversation. Mrs. Abernathy, their longtime housekeeper, could be heard greeting someone, presumably Mr. Hartwell, come to escort the family to their appointed positions. "Come," Jonathan commanded, straightening his black wool coat. "Let us not keep the gentleman waiting. Time is of the essence in these matters." The family proceeded outside, where Mr. Hartwell had indeed set up his camera equipment near the massive oak tree that dominated the front lawn. The tree was ancient, its gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like arthritic fingers, and its trunk was so wide that it would take 4 grown men with outstretched arms to encircle it completely. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood, madam." Mr. Hartwell greeted them with professional courtesy. He was a thin, precise man in his 50s, with wire-rimmed spectacles and a meticulously waxed mustache. I've taken the liberty of selecting this location based on your specifications. The lighting is indeed excellent, though I must say the tree does cast rather dramatic shadows. The shadows are exactly what we want, Jonathan replied cryptically, causing Mr. Hartwell to raise an eyebrow. Very well, sir. Now, if you would position yourselves here. Mr. Hartwell gestured to a spot in front of the tree. Mr. Blackwood, please stand behind your family. Mrs. Blackwood, if you would take the center position with Miss Margaret to your right and Master Thomas to your left. As the family arranged themselves according to the photographer's instructions, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The sensation was so strong that she found herself glancing over her shoulder multiple times, but she saw nothing except the imposing facade of Blackwood Manor and the empty windows that seemed to stare down at them like dead eyes. Please remain perfectly still, Mr. Hartwell instructed, ducking behind his camera and adjusting the lens. The exposure will take approximately 30 seconds. Any movement during that time will result in a blurred image. Jonathan placed his hands on Eleanor's shoulders, and she could feel the slight tremor in his fingers, even through the fabric of her dress. Margaret stood rigid as a statue, her chin lifted with adolescent dignity, while Thomas fidgeted slightly until a sharp look from his mother encouraged him to stillness. "Ready?" Mr. Hartwell called. 1, 2, 3. The camera clicked, and for the next 30 seconds, the Blackwood family stood frozen in time. During those long moments, Eleanor became acutely aware of every sound around them. The whisper of wind through the oak's leaves, the distant call of a crow, and something else, a soft rustling that seemed to come from directly behind them, though she knew there was nothing there but the tree trunk. "Excellent," Mr. Hartwell announced, emerging from behind his camera. "That should produce a fine portrait. I'll develop the plate immediately and have a preliminary print ready for your inspection within the hour." As the family began to relax and move away from their positions, Thomas tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mother, did you feel that?" "Feel what, dear?" "It was like someone was standing right behind us, someone cold." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine, not just from Thomas's words, but because she had felt something similar, a presence that seemed to emanate an unnatural coldness despite the warm October sunshine. "Don't be silly, Thomas," Margaret said, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. "There was no one behind us except the tree." "The boy is more perceptive than you give him credit for," Jonathan observed, his pale eyes fixed on the spot where they had just been standing. "Some people are naturally sensitive to influences that others cannot detect." An hour later, the family gathered in the drawing room as Mr. Hartwell carefully removed a photographic plate from his portable developing solution. The chemical smell of the development process lingered in the air as he held the glass plate up to the light. "Ah, yes," he murmured, adjusting his spectacles. "This has turned out quite well. The composition is excellent, and everyone appears sharp and clear. Let me just make a print for you to examine more closely." As Mr. Hartwell worked with his printing chemicals and paper, Eleanor found herself studying her husband's face. Jonathan's expression was one of intense anticipation, as if he were waiting for confirmation of something he already knew to be true. "Here we are," Mr. Hartwell announced, lifting a dripping photograph from the developer solution and placing it in a tray of fixing solution. "Just a few more minutes and it will be ready for viewing." Those few minutes stretched like hours. Margaret paced near the window. Thomas examined Mr. Hartwell's equipment with barely contained curiosity, and Jonathan stood motionless as a statue, his eyes never leaving the developing photograph. Finally, Mr. Hartwell lifted the print from the solution and held it up to the light. His professional smile faltered slightly as he examined the image more closely. "Is something wrong?" Eleanor asked, noticing the photographer's changed expression. "I'm not entirely certain," Mr. Hartwell replied slowly. "Perhaps you should take a look for yourselves." The family crowded around as Mr. Hartwell placed the wet photograph on a clean towel. The image was clear and well composed, Jonathan standing behind his family with his hands on Eleanor's shoulders, Eleanor in the center with her serene expression, Margaret to the right with her dignified bearing, and Thomas to the left, trying to maintain his youthful composure. But behind them, cast against the massive trunk of the oak tree, was a fifth shadow, the unmistakable silhouette of a person who had not been present during the photograph. "That's impossible," Margaret whispered, her face pale. "There were only 4 of us." Mr. Hartwell cleaned his spectacles nervously. "I assure you, there must be a rational explanation, perhaps a trick of the light or some optical illusion created by the branches." But even as he spoke, it was clear that the shadow was too distinct, too human in its proportions, to be explained away as a natural phenomenon. It appeared to be the shadow of a woman, tall and slender, with long hair and what looked like a dress from an earlier era. Thomas reached out with a trembling finger to point at the mysterious shadow. "Who is she?" Jonathan's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. "I believe," he said, his eyes never leaving the photograph, "that she is the reason we were brought here." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "What do you mean, brought here?" "The inheritance of this house, the sudden desire to have a family portrait taken after all these years." Jonathan's voice grew stronger, more certain. "I don't think any of it has been coincidence. I think someone or something has been guiding events toward this moment." Mr. Hartwell began hurriedly packing his equipment. "I think perhaps I should leave you to discuss this family matter in private. I'll send you the final prints once they're ready, along with my bill." "Wait," Eleanor called after him. "You've seen something like this before, haven't you? In other photographs?" The photographer paused at the door, his face grave. "In 30 years of taking photographs, Mrs. Blackwood, I have learned that cameras sometimes capture things that the human eye cannot see. Whether that's because the camera is more sensitive to certain phenomena, or because the subjects themselves are somehow connected to those phenomena, I cannot say, but I can tell you this. When such images appear, they usually mean that something significant is about to happen." After Mr. Hartwell departed, the family stood in silence, staring at the photograph that lay on the table between them like an accusation. "Father," Margaret said finally, "you knew this would happen, didn't you? That's why you insisted on the portrait." Jonathan nodded slowly. "I've been seeing her for months. At first I thought it was the laudanum playing tricks on my mind, but then the servants began reporting strange occurrences, doors opening by themselves, footsteps in empty hallways, and always the sense of being watched by someone who wasn't there." "Why didn't you tell us?" Eleanor asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Because I needed proof. Because I needed you to see for yourselves that the stories about this house, about the Blackwood family, might be more than just stories." Thomas, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "What stories, Father? What stories about our family?" Jonathan looked at his youngest child for a long moment before answering. "Stories about why my uncle left this house to me instead of his own children. Stories about what happened to his daughter, Catherine, who disappeared one night 50 years ago and was never found. Stories about how the Blackwood family came to own this land in the first place, and what we might have done to deserve it." The photograph seemed to shimmer in the afternoon light filtering through the windows, and for a moment, Eleanor could have sworn she saw the mysterious shadow move independently of the others. "We need to learn more about this house," she said with sudden determination, "about its history, about Catherine, about everything that's been hidden from us." "Are you certain you want to know?" Jonathan asked. "Some knowledge, once gained, cannot be forgotten." Eleanor looked at her children, Margaret with her fierce intelligence, Thomas with his curious nature, and then at the photograph that had revealed a presence they had never suspected. "Yes," she said firmly, "we need to know the truth. All of it." Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the ancient oak tree and casting shifting shadows across the windows of Blackwood Manor. Somewhere in the house, a door creaked open, though no one was there to open it. The Blackwood family's investigation into their past was about to begin, and none of them could imagine where it would lead them. The next morning dawned grey and overcast, with a persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into the very bones of Blackwood Manor. Eleanor woke early, having spent a restless night filled with dreams of shadowy figures and whispered voices. The photograph from the previous day had been carefully placed in the family Bible for safekeeping, but its image remained burned into her memory. After breakfast, during which the family barely spoke, Eleanor made her decision. "Children," she announced, "today we're going to explore the house thoroughly. Every room, every closet, every corner that we've never properly examined." "Even the locked rooms in the East Wing?" Thomas asked, his eyes wide with excitement despite the somber circumstances. Jonathan, who had been unusually quiet over his morning coffee, looked up sharply. "The East Wing has been sealed for good reason. Some doors are meant to remain closed." "No more secrets, Jonathan," Eleanor said firmly. "If there are answers to be found in this house, we're going to find them, starting with the attic." The attic of Blackwood Manor was accessed through a narrow staircase hidden behind a door on the 3rd floor. Eleanor had been up there only once before, shortly after they'd moved in 5 years ago, and had found it filled with dust, cobwebs, and what appeared to be several decades' worth of accumulated furniture and personal effects. Margaret carried a kerosene lamp to light their way, while Thomas lugged a carpet beater to clear away the worst of the cobwebs. Eleanor brought a notebook to record any significant findings, and Jonathan followed reluctantly behind, muttering about disturbing things that were better left undisturbed. The attic was exactly as Eleanor remembered it, a vast space under the eaves, filled with furniture covered in dust sheets, trunks stacked against the walls, and portraits of long-dead relatives staring down from improvised easels. The air was thick and stale, carrying the musty scent of old fabric and forgotten time. "Where should we start?" Margaret asked, holding the lamp high to survey the cluttered space. "Let's begin with those trunks," Eleanor suggested, pointing to a collection of leather-bound chests near the far wall. "They look like they might contain personal papers or family documents." As they made their way through the accumulated debris of decades, Thomas suddenly stopped and pointed to a corner where several portraits were leaning against the wall. "Mother, look at this one." Eleanor approached and gasped. The portrait showed a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, with dark hair and intelligent eyes. She was wearing a dress that appeared to be from the 1850s, and her resemblance to Margaret was unmistakable. "The nameplate," Margaret whispered, kneeling down to read the small brass plaque attached to the frame. "Catherine Blackwood, 1837-1857. Uncle Cornelius's daughter," Jonathan said quietly, appearing behind them. "The one who disappeared." Eleanor studied the portrait more carefully. There was something familiar about Catherine's face, something that nagged at the edge of her memory. "Jonathan, bring the photograph from yesterday. I want to compare them." Jonathan reluctantly produced the family photograph from his coat pocket. Eleanor held it next to Catherine's portrait, and the family collectively drew in their breath. The shadow in the photograph, while indistinct, bore an unmistakable resemblance to the young woman in the painting. "It's her," Thomas said in an awed whisper. "The shadow is Catherine." "Don't be ridiculous," Margaret said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Shadows in photographs don't prove the existence of what, Margaret?" Eleanor asked gently. "Of spirits, of unfinished business, of family secrets that refuse to stay buried." While Margaret struggled with her rational skepticism, Eleanor began examining the trunks. The first one she opened contained women's clothing from the 1850s. Elaborate dresses with full skirts, delicate undergarments, and accessories that must have belonged to Catherine. Everything was carefully preserved, as if someone had been expecting her return. The second trunk held books, poetry collections, novels, and personal journals written in a feminine hand. Eleanor carefully lifted one of the journals and opened it to a random page. "Listen to this," she said, and began to read aloud. "Father grows more distant each day. He speaks of business concerns and family obligations, but I fear there is something darker troubling him. He has forbidden me from going into the East Wing, claiming it's unsafe, but I hear sounds from there at night, voices and footsteps where no one should be walking." "When was that written?" Jonathan asked, his face pale. Eleanor checked the date at the top of the page. "April 15th, 1857, just a few months before she disappeared." Thomas had wandered over to another collection of items and was examining what appeared to be architectural drawings. "Mother, come look at these. They're blueprints of the house, but they show rooms that don't exist anymore." Eleanor joined him, spreading the yellowed papers on a dusty table. The blueprints were indeed of Blackwood Manor, but they showed a very different layout than the current house. The east wing, which now contained only a few small, locked rooms, was depicted as a grand ballroom with adjacent chambers labeled as private study, library, and ceremonial room. "Ceremonial room?" Margaret asked, reading over her mother's shoulder. "What kind of ceremonies would require a special room?" "Let me see Catherine's journal again," Eleanor said, flipping through the pages more systematically. "There might be more information here." As she read through the entries, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Catherine wrote about her father's involvement with a group of men who met regularly in the house, always in the east wing, always late at night. She described strange lights, unusual odors, and sounds that seemed almost ritualistic in nature. "June 3rd, 1857, Eleanor read. "Father's associates gathered again last night. I could hear chanting from the ceremonial room, and there was a smell in the air like sulfur and burning herbs. When I asked Father about it this morning, he became angry and told me I must never speak of what I might see or hear in this house. He said the family's prosperity depends on maintaining certain traditions." "What kind of traditions?" Thomas asked, though his voice suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Eleanor continued reading. "June 10th, 1857. I fear I have learned too much. Last night, I saw Father and his companions bringing something into the ceremonial room, something wrapped in black cloth that moved as if it were alive. The sounds that followed were inhuman. I am beginning to understand why Father is so insistent that I marry Mr. Harrison and leave this house immediately. He wants me gone before—" The entry ended abruptly, as if Catherine had been interrupted while writing. "Before what?" Margaret demanded. What was she going to say? Eleanor flipped through the remaining pages, but they were blank. This was her last entry. She disappeared just days later. "Oh, Father," Thomas said, turning to Jonathan with wide eyes, "what do you know about the East Wing? About what great-uncle Cornelius was doing there?" Jonathan sat heavily on a covered chair, creating a small cloud of dust. "I know only what was told to me when I inherited the house. Cornelius left instructions that the East Wing was to remain sealed, and that under no circumstances should anyone attempt to enter the ceremonial room. He said there were protections in place that could be dangerous if disturbed." "Protections against what?" Eleanor asked. "He never said specifically, but he did mention that the Blackwood family's wealth and success had been purchased at a considerable price, and that the debt would have to be paid eventually." Margaret, who had been examining another trunk, suddenly called out, "Mother, you need to see this." She was holding a leather-bound ledger filled with columns of figures and dates. But these weren't ordinary business accounts. Each entry showed a date, an amount of money, and what appeared to be a description of services rendered. But the services were unlike anything Eleanor had ever seen. "July 1855, Margaret read. "Payment to Madame Laveau, $500, for consultation regarding blood obligations." August 1855, payment to Brother Morteus, $300, for procurement of sanctified materials. September 1855, payment to the Circle of Seven, $1,000, for annual renewal of covenant. Covenant? Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of covenant? Jonathan's face had gone ashen. "I think," he said slowly, "we're beginning to understand what happened to Catherine." Before anyone could respond, a loud crash echoed through the house from somewhere below them. The family froze, listening intently. The sound came again, definitely from the direction of the East Wing. "Stay here," Jonathan commanded, but Eleanor was already moving toward the attic stairs. "No more hiding, Jonathan. If something in this house wants our attention, it's going to get it." As they descended the stairs, the crashes became louder and more frequent, accompanied by what sounded like doors slamming open and shut in rapid succession. By the time they reached the main floor, the sounds had stopped, but an unmistakable smell hung in the air. Sulfur and burning herbs, exactly as Catherine had described in her journal. The family stood in the main hallway, listening to the oppressive silence that had replaced the violent sounds. Thomas was the first to notice the change. "The east wing door," he whispered, pointing down the hallway. "It's open." Eleanor looked where he was pointing. The heavy oak door that had been locked for as long as they had lived in the house now stood wide open, revealing a dark corridor beyond. "It's impossible," Jonathan muttered. "I have the only key, and it's been in my study safe for 5 years." "Apparently," Eleanor said, gathering her courage, "someone or something has decided we no longer need a key." As they stood there debating their next move, a sound drifted from the open doorway that made their blood run cold. It was the sound of a woman weeping, soft and mournful, echoing from somewhere deep within the east wing. "Catherine," Margaret whispered. Eleanor squared her shoulders. "Children, I want you to stay here while your father and I investigate." "Absolutely not," Margaret said firmly. "If we're going to face whatever is in this house, we're going to face it as a family." Thomas nodded his agreement, though his face was pale with fear. Jonathan looked at his wife and children, his family, united in their determination to uncover the truth, and realized that there was no turning back now. Whatever secrets the East Wing held, whatever price the Blackwood family had paid for their prosperity, it was time to confront it all. "Very well," he said, "but we stay together no matter what we find." As they approached the open doorway, the weeping grew louder, and with it came the distinct scent of roses, Catherine's favorite perfume, according to her journal. The East Wing was waiting for them, with all its dark secrets and half-century-old mysteries. And somewhere in that darkness, Catherine Blackwood was calling them home. The East Wing of Blackwood Manor felt like stepping into a tomb. Despite having been sealed for decades, the air was surprisingly fresh, carrying that persistent scent of roses mixed with something far more unsettling, an underlying odor of decay and old blood that seemed to seep from the very walls. Eleanor led the way with Margaret's kerosene lamp, casting wavering shadows that danced across walls lined with portraits of Blackwood ancestors. Their painted eyes seemed to follow the family's progress down the long corridor, and more than once, Thomas swore he saw one of the figures actually turn its head. "The layout matches the blueprints," Eleanor observed, consulting the architectural drawings they had brought from the attic. "According to this, the ceremonial room should be at the very end of the hall." As they progressed deeper into the wing, they passed several doors, all standing open to reveal rooms that were not only intact, but appeared to have been recently used. The private study contained a desk covered with books about the occult, demonology, and what appeared to be historical accounts of various supernatural practices. The library's shelves were filled with volumes that Eleanor had never seen before, leather-bound books with symbols instead of titles, written in languages she couldn't identify. "Father," Thomas whispered, tugging at Jonathan's coat sleeve, "look at the paintings." Jonathan followed his son's gaze to a series of portraits lining the hallway. Unlike the formal family portraits they had seen elsewhere in the house, these paintings depicted the same people, various Blackwood ancestors, but shown in disturbing contexts. Here was Cornelius Blackwood, standing in what appeared to be a ritual circle, surrounded by robed figures. There was another ancestor, Ezekiel Blackwood, holding what looked like an ancient tome, while strange symbols glowed around him. "My God," Eleanor breathed, stopping before a particularly unsettling portrait. "Jonathan, this one is of you." The painting showed Jonathan standing in what was unmistakably the ceremonial room, wearing elaborate robes and holding a ceremonial dagger. But the most disturbing aspect was the expression on painted Jonathan's face, one of grim determination mixed with deep sorrow. "That's impossible," Jonathan said, his voice shaking. "I've never posed for such a portrait. I've never even been in this wing before today." Margaret, who had been examining the painting more closely, pointed to a small plaque at the bottom of the frame. "It's dated next month, Father, November 1907. Before anyone could process the implications of this revelation, the sound of weeping grew noticeably louder. It was definitely coming from the ceremonial room ahead of them. "Catherine," Eleanor called out softly. "Catherine, if that's you, we're here to help. We want to understand what happened to you." The weeping stopped immediately, replaced by a silence so profound that they could hear their own heartbeats. Then, from the direction of the ceremonial room, came a voice, soft, feminine, and unmistakably desperate. "Help me," the voice whispered. "Please, help me." The family exchanged glances, each seeing their own fear reflected in the others' faces, but there was no turning back now. The ceremonial room was unlike anything they had ever seen. It was circular, with a domed ceiling painted with astrological symbols and mystical diagrams. The walls were lined with shelves containing jars filled with unidentifiable substances, ancient artifacts, and more of those mysterious books with symbol-covered spines. In the center of the room was a large stone altar, stained dark with what could only be blood. Carved into the stone were intricate symbols that seemed to shift and move when viewed directly. Surrounding the altar was a complex pattern inlaid into the floor, circles within circles, connected by lines and filled with symbols that made Eleanor's eyes water when she tried to focus on them. But the most shocking discovery was not the room itself, but what they found sitting on a chair near the altar. A young woman, translucent and shimmering, wearing a dress identical to one they had seen in Catherine's trunk. She looked up as they entered, and Eleanor gasped at the profound sadness in her eyes. "Catherine," Eleanor whispered. The apparition nodded. "I've been waiting so long for someone to come, for someone to listen." Thomas instinctively moved closer to his parents, while Margaret stood frozen, her rational mind struggling to process what she was seeing. "What happened to you?" Eleanor asked gently. "What happened in 1857? Catherine's form flickered, becoming more solid as she began to speak. "Father discovered that I knew about his activities, about the covenant he had made to ensure the family's prosperity. He was afraid I would expose everything, ruin the arrangements he had spent years establishing." "What kind of covenant?" Jonathan asked, though he seemed to already fear the answer. "The Blackwood family's wealth didn't come from honest business dealings, Uncle Jonathan. It came from a pact made with entities that exist beyond the normal world, beings that demand payment in exchange for their gifts." Catherine gestured toward the altar. "Every generation, one member of the family must be offered as payment. It was supposed to be Father, but when his time came, he substituted me instead." Eleanor felt sick. "He killed his own daughter?" "Not exactly killed," Catherine said sadly. "The ritual doesn't destroy the body immediately. It binds the soul to this place, to serve as an anchor for the entity's influence in our world. I've been trapped here for 50 years, watching over the family, trying to warn them about what's coming." "What's coming?" Margaret asked, finding her voice at last. Catherine looked directly at Jonathan. "The covenant requires renewal every 50 years. Father renewed it in 1857 using me as payment. Now it's time for the next renewal." Jonathan's face went white. "That's why I inherited the house. That's why Uncle Cornelius left it to me instead of his own surviving children. He knew you had the sensitivity needed to perform the ritual," Catherine confirmed. "The laudanum you've been taking, it wasn't medicinal. It was preparation designed to open your mind to the entity's influence and make you more receptive to their commands." Eleanor grabbed her husband's arm. "Jonathan, tell me you haven't been taking orders from whatever these things are." Jonathan's silence was answer enough. "The portrait session," Thomas said suddenly. "That's why you insisted on having the photograph taken." You knew Catherine would appear in it. I needed you all to see, Jonathan said miserably. I needed you to understand that this is bigger than our family, bigger than our choices. The entities have been guiding events for months, ensuring that everything would be in place for the renewal ceremony. Or, what does the ceremony require? Eleanor demanded. Catherine answered before Jonathan could speak. A willing sacrifice from the family bloodline. Someone young enough to serve for the full 50-year term. The implication hit Eleanor like a physical blow. The children, you're talking about sacrificing one of our children. Not one of them, Jonathan said quietly. Both of them. The room erupted in chaos. Margaret screamed in rage and terror. Thomas began crying, and Eleanor felt as though the floor had dropped out from under her. The covenant has grown stronger over the decades, Catherine explained over the family's anguish. The entities now require 2 anchors to maintain their hold on this realm. 1 male, 1 female, both from the direct family line. I won't let this happen, Eleanor declared, placing herself protectively in front of her children. I don't care what kind of pact was made or what consequences we might face. I will not allow my children to be sacrificed for some demonic agreement. You don't understand, Jonathan said desperately. If the covenant isn't renewed, the entities will take their payment anyway. But instead of just Margaret and Thomas, they'll take everyone. You, me, the children, and probably everyone else who lives on the property. The servants, the townspeople who depend on our family's business, they'll all pay the price for our defiance. Then we break the covenant, Margaret said with fierce determination. There has to be a way to end this permanently. Catherine shook her head sadly. I've had 50 years to search for a way out. The only method I've found requires a sacrifice even greater than what the entities demand. What do you mean? Eleanor asked. The person who originally made the pact must willingly give up everything, their life, their soul, their very existence, to sever the connection permanently. But that person was my father, Cornelius, and he's been dead for 15 years. Thomas, who had been listening with the sharp intelligence that children often display in crisis situations, suddenly spoke up. But Uncle Cornelius isn't the one who made the original pact, is he? You said this has been going on for generations. Catherine stared at the boy with something approaching hope. You're right. The original pact was made by the first Blackwood to own this land, Ezekiel Blackwood, in 1807. And where is Ezekiel? Eleanor asked. Jonathan answered reluctantly. He's buried in the family crypt beneath the house, along with every other Blackwood who has lived here for the past 100 years. Including Uncle Cornelius, Margaret added, her quick mind beginning to see possibilities. If the dead can be bound to serve these entities, Eleanor said slowly, then perhaps they can also be called upon to break free from them. Catherine's ghostly form began to glow more brightly. You think we could summon the family spirits, convince them to work together to break the covenant permanently? I think, Eleanor said with growing conviction, that we're about to find out. Jonathan, you know the rituals. You've been preparing for them. Can the same methods used to serve these entities be turned against them? It would be incredibly dangerous, Jonathan warned. If we fail, the consequences would be far worse than simply honoring the covenant. Eleanor looked at her husband, then at her children, and finally at the spirit of the young woman who had been trapped for 50 years by her family's greed and desperation. Some things are worth the risk, she said firmly. Catherine, are you willing to help us try? I've been waiting 50 years for someone to ask, Catherine replied, her form growing more solid and determined. What do you need me to do? As the family began planning their desperate attempt to break a century-old supernatural covenant, none of them noticed the shadows in the corners of the ceremonial room beginning to shift and coalesce. The entities were listening, and they were not pleased with this turn of events. The real battle for the Blackwood family's souls was about to begin. The family crypt lay beneath the oldest section of Blackwood Manor, accessible through a narrow stone staircase hidden behind a false wall in the wine cellar. Eleanor had never been down there before. Jonathan had always claimed it was too dangerous, with unstable stairs and bad air. Now she understood the real reason for his reluctance. The crypt was vast, extending far beyond what the manor's foundation should have allowed. Dozens of stone sarcophagi lined the walls, each bearing the name and dates of a Blackwood ancestor. The air was thick with the scent of decay and something else, that same sulphurous odor that had permeated the east wing. "There," Catherine said, her ghostly form providing an ethereal light in the darkness. "Ezekiel's tomb is at the far end, directly beneath the ceremonial room." As they made their way through the crypt, Margaret noticed something disturbing about the inscriptions on the tombs. "Mother, look at the death dates. They all died on the same day of the year, October 31st. Halloween," Thomas whispered. "They all died on Halloween." "Not died," Catherine corrected grimly. "Sacrificed. Each generation's payment to the covenant, taken on the night when the veil between worlds is thinnest." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. "Halloween is in 2 weeks, which is why," Jonathan said heavily, "I've been having such vivid dreams lately. The entities are preparing me, ensuring I'll be ready to perform the ceremony." When they reached Ezekiel's tomb, they found it different from the others. While the other sarcophagi were simple stone rectangles, Ezekiel's was covered in the same mystical symbols they had seen in the ceremonial room. More disturbing still, the symbols seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, pulsing with a rhythm that matched a human heartbeat. "He's not truly dead, is he?" Eleanor asked. "None of them are," Catherine replied. "The covenant sustains them in a state between life and death, binding their souls to serve the entity's purposes. That's why breaking free requires their willing cooperation." Margaret had been studying the symbols on the tomb. "These markings, they're similar to the ones in Father's occult books, but arranged differently." "Catherine, do you know what they mean?" "They're binding sigils, designed to keep Ezekiel's spirit contained within the tomb, while allowing the entities to draw upon his power. To summon him, we need to modify the pattern." "Modify it how?" Eleanor asked. Catherine floated closer to the tomb, examining the symbols carefully. "We need to create a summoning circle that includes all the family spirits, not just Ezekiel, but everyone who has been sacrificed over the past century. Together, they might have enough combined will to break the covenant permanently." Jonathan had been unusually quiet during this discussion, and Eleanor noticed he was sweating despite the chill air of the crypt. "Jonathan, are you all right?" "The entities," he whispered. "They're trying to stop me from helping you. I can feel them in my mind, commanding me to prevent this." As if summoned by his words, the temperature in the crypt dropped dramatically. The faint light from Catherine's spirit began to flicker, and shadows started moving independently of any light source. "They know what we're planning," Catherine said urgently. "We need to act quickly." Eleanor pulled out the piece of chalk she had brought from Jonathan's study. "Tell me what to draw." Working under Catherine's direction, Eleanor began modifying the symbols on Ezekiel's tomb, while Margaret did the same on the surrounding sarcophagi. Thomas kept watch for any sign that the entities were manifesting physically, while Jonathan struggled against the growing influence, trying to take control of his actions. I can't fight them much longer," Jonathan gasped, his hands beginning to shake violently. "Eleanor, whatever you're going to do it now." "Almost finished," Eleanor replied, adding the final marks to the summoning circle. "Catherine, what's the incantation?" "There isn't one in any language you would know," Catherine said, "but if you speak from your heart, if you call to them as family, they'll hear you." Eleanor placed her hands on Ezekiel's tomb and closed her eyes. "Ezekiel Blackwood, first of our line to be bound by this covenant, I call upon you to help us break the chains that have held our family for 100 years. Rise and aid your descendants in reclaiming their freedom." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the symbols on the tomb began glowing more brightly, and a low, rumbling sound echoed through the crypt. One by one, the other tombs began to show similar signs of activity. "It's working," Margaret breathed. The first spirit to appear was Ezekiel himself, a tall, severe-looking man in clothes from the early 1800s. Unlike Catherine, who appeared translucent and ethereal, Ezekiel seemed more solid, more present. "Who dares disturb my rest?" he demanded, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Your family," Eleanor replied firmly. "Your descendants, who refuse to continue paying the price for your bargain." Ezekiel's ghostly eyes fixed on Jonathan, who was now visibly fighting against some invisible force. "The covenant must be honored. The consequences of breaking it are beyond your comprehension." "The consequences of honoring it are beyond ours," Eleanor shot back. "You've condemned generations of your own family to death or supernatural servitude. It ends now." Other spirits were beginning to manifest throughout the crypt. A century's worth of Blackwood ancestors, all bearing the marks of their supernatural bondage. Some appeared resigned, others angry, but all turned to look at the living family members with expressions of desperate hope. "Tell them about the choice," Catherine urged Ezekiel. "Tell them what breaking the covenant would require." Ezekiel's expression grew even more grim. To break a covenant of this magnitude requires the willing sacrifice of the one who made it. But not just death, complete annihilation, the destruction of the soul itself, with no hope of afterlife or continuation. "Then do it," Eleanor said without hesitation. "End this curse permanently." "You don't understand," Ezekiel replied. "If I destroy myself to break the covenant, every benefit the family has gained from it will be lost as well. The wealth, the property, the social position, all of it will vanish. Your children will inherit nothing but debts and disgrace." Margaret stepped forward. "Good. We don't want wealth that was bought with blood." Thomas nodded his agreement. "We'd rather be poor and free than rich and cursed." Eleanor felt a surge of pride at her children's courage. "You have your answer, Ezekiel. Your living descendants choose freedom over prosperity." But before Ezekiel could respond, the shadows in the crypt suddenly coalesced into solid forms, beings of darkness with glowing red eyes and voices like grinding stone. "The covenant will not be broken," they intoned in unison. "The debt will be paid as agreed." The entities moved toward Margaret and Thomas, their shadowy forms reaching out with claws of pure darkness. But as they did, something unexpected happened. The other Blackwood spirits, dozens of them now fully manifested in the crypt, stepped forward to block their path. "Enough," said a woman's voice. Eleanor recognized her from one of the portraits as Ezekiel's wife, Martha. "We have served you for a century, paid your price with our children's lives and our own souls. No more." "The boy speaks truth," added another spirit, a man from the mid-1800s. "We choose poverty and freedom over wealth and bondage." One by one, the spirits of the Blackwood dead declared their support for breaking the covenant, despite the cost. Even those who had been sacrificed willingly in previous generations now stood united against the entities that had enslaved their family. "Very well," Ezekiel said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of his decision. "If this is the will of our family, both living and dead, then let it be done." He began to glow with an intense white light that made the entities hiss and recoil. "By my willing sacrifice, by the complete destruction of my soul, I renounce the covenant made in 1807. Let the Blackwood name be free of supernatural debt, now and forever." The light emanating from Ezekiel grew blindingly bright. The entities shrieked in rage and pain as their hold on the physical world began to weaken. But they made one final, desperate attempt to claim their payment, lunging toward the living family members. They never reached them. Every Blackwood spirit in the crypt interposed themselves between the entities and the living, forming an impenetrable barrier of family loyalty and love. Catherine stood directly in front of Eleanor, her ghostly form blazing with protective energy. "Thank you," Catherine said, looking back at Eleanor with tears of joy in her spectral eyes. "Thank you for setting us all free." The light from Ezekiel's self-sacrifice reached its peak, and with a sound like thunder, both he and the entities vanished completely. The other spirits began to fade as well, their bonds to the earthly realm finally broken. "Go in peace," Eleanor called to them as they departed. "You've earned your rest." Catherine was the last to fade, lingering just long enough to smile at the family she had helped save. "Take care of each other," she whispered. and then she too was gone. The crypt fell silent except for the sound of the family's breathing. Jonathan, freed from the entity's influence, collapsed to his knees in exhaustion and relief. "Is it over?" Thomas asked. Eleanor looked around the crypt. The mystical symbols on the tombs had gone dark, and the oppressive atmosphere that had filled the space was completely gone. Above them, she could hear sounds of structural stress. The house itself was beginning to change. "Yes," she said, helping Jonathan to his feet. "It's over, but we need to leave the house immediately." As they made their way back upstairs, the changes to Blackwood Manor became apparent. Expensive furnishings were crumbling to dust, valuable paintings were fading from their frames, and portions of the house that had been magically maintained were showing their true age. By the time they reached the front lawn, much of the manor had collapsed into ruins. The family stood together, watching their former home return to the state it would have been in without supernatural intervention. "What will we do now?" Margaret asked. Eleanor put her arms around her children and looked at her husband, who for the first time in months appeared completely lucid and at peace. "We'll rebuild," she said simply. "We'll start over with our own hands and our own labor. We'll be poor, probably, but we'll be free." Jonathan nodded, taking Eleanor's hand. "The laudanum, the voices, the compulsions, they're all gone. I feel like myself again for the first time in years." As the sun began to set on October 13th, 1907, the Blackwood family walked away from their ancestral home, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and a newfound appreciation for the value of freedom. Behind them, the ruins of Blackwood Manor stood as a testament to the price of supernatural bargains and the power of family love to overcome even the darkest of curses. The photograph that had started their investigation lay buried somewhere in the rubble, but they no longer needed it. They had found the truth, faced it bravely, and chosen the difficult path of freedom over the easy road of corruption. And somewhere in the distance, if they listened carefully, they could almost hear the sound of Catherine's laughter carried on the evening wind, the laughter of a spirit finally at peace. The Blackwood family's encounter with the supernatural was over, but their real life, their free life, was just beginning. Legal disclaimer: this story is completely fictional and created for entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, real events or real institutions is purely coincidental. The supernatural elements and historical references are fictional and not intended to represent actual historical facts or promote belief in paranormal activities. The story is set in 1907 and includes period-appropriate language and social contexts for narrative authenticity.